Will, welcome back to Talk Python to me. It's great to talk with you.
Thank you. It's good to be here again.
Yeah, it's going to be really fun. I've built some really cool apps with Rich, and we're going to
Cool.
talk about Rich and Textual. Probably a little more on the textual side this time
Hmm.
around, but still a very cool revolution you're bringing to the terminal.
Yeah, a very quiet but pretty revolution. I like it.
Indeed. Okay, so we want to talk about textual. You wrote a cool article called Algorithms for High Performance Terminal Apps, which I thought would be fun to dive in, but we're going to also keep it more of a broad ranging conversation. At the start of all that, it's been a little while since I've had you on the show. You can tell people who maybe haven't listened to that episode or episodes who you are.
Sure. My name is Will McGugan. I'm a software developer, Python developer, probably like most of your listeners. I achieved a certain amount of infamy when I built this library called Rich, which a lot of people use. If you see some fancy output in your terminal, that might have been me. And I founded a startup called Textualize, which is all about improving the developer experience in the terminal.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure we'll discuss Textual, which is my other Python library,
Yeah,
in this show.
yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited for it. And is this the close to the 1 year anniversary for Textual? Is that there was an
Um,
anniversary of some sort? Because we're going to talk about one of your articles,
it's
and
actually closer to 3 years since
is
I
it?
founded
Oh
Textualize.
no, it's not anniversary. It's the 1.0 milestone, not the
Oh, right, yeah, yep,
1.0 year, the 1.0 version. There we go.
yep.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, so Textual follows Semver, which I imagine people are familiar with.
Mhm.
When you're on the zero version, you have a bit of flexibility and you can make breaking changes. We try not to, but you can make breaking changes, and it gives you a bit of freedom early on to play around with things. But some people stick to zero ver just forever, which is fine if that's what you do. But when you go to 1.0, it advertises to people that this is stable. You can rely on the interface not changing too quickly, and it being kind of, if there are any changes, it's well documented. So it's, if you followed along, it's a very modest release from the last zero version to the 1.0 version. But it says to the world, hey, we think Textualize is ready. You can start using it in production, even though you could probably have been using it in production for a year.
I'm sure that you could have. I'm sure you could have. Are you familiar with zerover.org? The numeral zero ver.org. Have you seen this?
No, I didn't. I thought it was just an aspect of Semver. I didn't realize it
It
was.
it is absolutely an aspect of Semver, but this I can't remember who put this together. Does it say at the bottom? Let's see about the about page. Published. Yeah, that's what I thought. I thought it was Mahmoud Hashemi. Amazing. Yeah. So Mahmoud put this together, and basically it calls out. I think it's a little contrarian to There's a lot of especially larger companies that have rules about what version you're allowed to use and is software ready enough. If it's a point 0.3, we can't use it. It's not ready. Not till it's a 1.0 or a 2.0 or something along those lines, right? And so this
Yeah.
is the popular projects that are still really low in their versions. It says welcome to Semver 0.0.1. And if you go down here, it says like, look, React Native is 0.78,
Right. Right. Yeah.
even though it's 10 years old. Hugo, which I use for my blog and love it, it's got 77,000 GitHub stars. It's first released 12 years
More
ago.
more than more than a decade
It's
long. Yeah.
it's still zero. It's still zero dot something. Let's
I
see if
think
there's
the
some that are really
yeah
extreme here.
I think the problem is that non-software developers have a different idea what versions mean.
Yes, I know.
We know that they're about compatibility, but when you're marketing it, 1.0 is like you advertise it, you make a splash about it,
That's when it's
and then
actually out. You can use it. The other one's just
yeah,
like a toy,
yeah,
right?
and then boom, 2.0.
Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah.
NeoVim 0.10. scikit-learn. It's 15 years old. It's 0.17. But so I think I totally hear what you're saying, right? About like, yes, this, and I think we both agree, like what this should mean. If your thing is 0.17, probably that means there's a good chance that there might be some adaptations to the API. At the same time, if you're scikit-learn and you've been around for 15 years,
Yeah,
it might
yeah.
be time to bump that to something over 0.17. You know what I mean? What do you think?
I think it's the developer-led projects, the ones which are just a bunch of developers releasing open source. We developers don't like to make too much promises.
Exactly.
If we were to put a
You're
1.0 on it,
who's going to be on the hook for making that 1.0 and then they're stuck with it, right?
exactly, yeah, we know that 1.0 is not going to be perfect and bug-free. So we don't necessarily want to be on the hook for it not being perfect.
Yeah, I know. At the same time, you're on the hook to not change scikit-learn at this point anyway.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I'm only picking on them because I know they're so well loved in the community and they're very, very common. Unlike, say, Rough, which is on this list, but Rough is pretty new, you know. Anyway, I think I'll put this in the show notes. Zerover. Thanks, Moody. That was really fun. So let's talk about terminals. Terminal revolution. I think it's a pretty interesting time for terminals. Both the application that runs your terminal, as well as closer to what you're doing, building applications that are like CLI apps or TUI apps, as we'll coin the term. No, you've coined the term. We'll tell people about the term if they don't know. Right? I mean, we've got Warp, we've got Ghost TTY. I don't know how you say Ghostity, whatever. A bunch of other options coming along for terminals that are make being in the terminal nicer, and I think also draw people into wanting to build apps that run in that space rather than try to get away from it, right? It's not Mac OS where it's just the default Z shell with no history and it's like white with weird fonts, or CMD on Windows where you're like, what is this thing, you know? What are your thoughts on this? I mean, first of all, like maybe just on the apps that run, do you have a favorite terminal app that you run?
I've been using iTerm for the last few years. It's kind of my daily driver. But there's a few other good ones. There's Alacrity and Kitty, and then Ghost TTY or Ghosty. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
that's a new kid on the block.
It is the new kid
and
on
it
the
is
block.
very good. It is very good indeed. But I like iTerm's feature set. It's not the fastest, but it's fairly reliable, and it's got lots of other features.
Do you,
I played around with. Yep.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I played around with warp.dev as well. I think that's a little too unconventional for me at the moment. They've done some very cool stuff though. So yeah, there's lots of innovation there.
It is really, it takes some getting used to. That's the one I've been using the last year or so, and I really, really enjoyed it. It does very cool things like, for example, if I'm on my computer and then I SSH into another computer, and then in that computer I Docker exec something into a Docker system, a Docker container, Warp will say, would you like to apply the Warp shell to this Docker container instead of whatever it does SH? I mean, it might not even have bash, right? It might just be SH. You just hit a button and it goes whoop. It adapts and basically become kind of like in memory installs itself into that container temporarily, right? That sets all the the settings and stuff. So like it's a long ways from cmd.exe. I guess it's worth pointing out to people out there on Windows, if you're not using Windows Terminal, please, right? You need to use Windows Terminal. It's such an improvement over
massive improvement.
Right. I mean, you probably run into this all the time, right?
Yeah, and the solution, if someone tries something in the terminal that uses retrotextual and it doesn't work properly, I first say, have you tried downloading Windows Terminal? And 99% of the time, it not only fixes it, but it makes it look beautiful. I mean, hats off to Microsoft. They didn't change the terminal for decades, but when they did, they made a very good job of it.
Yeah, it took a while. I don't know if it's the default yet. You know what I mean? I'm
I
not sure
think
what's
it's
actually presented if you kind of pull up the start menu.
it's a very strange architecture. You can pull up cmd.exe. That's what I've been used to calling it because it has it in the title bar.
Yeah,
But if
yeah.
you send it some magic codes, you can switch it into essentially Windows terminal. It'll process escape sequences like it does on Mac
Okay.
and Linux. So the actual window you see is just kind of like a window onto the thing which renders the terminal. So you can get Windows. You might already have Windows Terminal, even if you don't get the experience. But software can switch it into this mode, which makes it work really well.
Oh, I had no idea. That's cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's probably the same core for both of them or something, right?
Yeah, exactly. The architecture is very component based, and you can switch it at runtime.
Yeah,
So you
that
can
sounds
you
very
can make a terminal.
Microsoft.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there a code that you can put to embed, like if you can split the panes and then you can embed Excel on one side maybe, and then SharePoint on the other?
I haven't found it,
I'm just
but
kidding. I'm just kidding. I just feel like that's
I
something they
wouldn't
could
be
do.
surprised. Yeah.
I wouldn't either. I wouldn't either. Are you a fan of modifying your shell, I guess? Like, my ZSH or my Posh or Starship
Yeah,
or any of these?
yeah. To change the prompt. Yeah, I do have. I can't remember which one I use now. It's not. Is it Starship?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fairly minimal. It tells me the branch, the Git branch I'm working on, the version of Python it's running, and the version of the application I'm working on. So it's really nice.
Oh, it'll tell you the version of the application you're working on.
Yeah, but it says v1.0.0, so it's somehow pulled out the version from Textual, I guess.
Oh, wow. That's pretty cool. I guess if it's in a repo and it knows that repo is a package, it can figure out what version it is, but that's still pretty neat.
I guess
I
it must
mean,
go and
yeah.
inspect pyproject.toml, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's magic and it works, so don't delve
Yeah.
too deeply.
Yeah, the whole reason I'm bringing this up, it might feel like a little bit of a diversion, but when people think about terminal apps and just being in the terminal and somebody says, "Oh God, I hate the terminal. It's so bad. I can't stand it." It usually means they're not adopting some of these really magical tools, regardless of which one, regardless of whether you adopt Starship or Oh My ZSH or Warp or whatever. You get a dramatically different experience, right?
Yeah, it's infinitely customizable. The terminal and the shell and various other software. So you can get the kind of experience that you want out of a terminal. And people get very comfortable with their terminal environment. It feels like an old pair of shoes. It's just that comfortable.
I guess it depends what tools you use as well. For example, if you're a NeoVim or an Emacs type person, you're in the terminal even way more than, say, for me, for example, who uses PyCharm and other tools that,
Yeah.
I only dip in and out when I'm working on code for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, for me, I'm switching between terminal and VS Code most of the day. So I've got both open. I write some code and then I switch back to terminal and run said code. So I'm in both. Yeah, but I never, funnily enough, I never got into editors that run inside the terminal. I do like all the fancy graphics that VS Code can give you that a terminal couldn't.
Yeah.
That matters less to other people, but I like it.
You know what? When I started out doing programming, I started out doing a lot of work on Silicon Graphics mainframes, doing Emacs on Onyx workstations and stuff like that. And I was happy as a clam to get out of there as quick as possible to get out of. I'm like, can I get some better tools than this? And yeah, I don't know. I'm on the GUI side as well, but I feel like kind of like the terminal. If you don't customize your terminal, it's not a great experience. If you don't really can commit to learning all the hotkeys of your GUI app, well, it feels like, well, I got to use this mouse. It's all clunky, but like I almost never use the mouse. You know what I mean? Even though I'm in a
Yeah,
GUI app, right? They just
yeah.
customize the hotkeys.
I think you can get very proficient in both. You know,
Yeah.
I've seen people using a terminal and they use Emacs or Vim, and their fingers just fly through it, and they're
I
very
know.
proficient.
I
But
know.
the same thing in VS Code. If you know your editor and you know the shortcut keys, and you don't reach for the mouse very often, you can be just as proficient, really. At Textualize, we had a policy: if you use whatever you want to use to edit code, because if you take a developer who's uses Vim and then force them to use code, they will not be happy and they will not
No,
be
no, no, no.
as efficient at all. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really tricky balance, right? You want to let people work where they're comfortable, for sure. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's a good transition to TUI. What are TUIs? Why do people build them? I know we talked about this in the last episode, and we won't totally necessarily rehash it, but there are some, if people haven't seen it, there are some incredible applications, and we will see some built in Textual that run in the terminal.
Yeah, sure. So TUI stands for Text User Interface. I don't actually like that term anymore.
Okay.
And
What
the
would you
reason
like?
is, well, the thing is, the TUIs that you build with Textual are also GUIs. It's
Yeah.
a very simplified form of graphics, but we've got lines, and corners, and you've got like a mouse that you can move around. So it is rendered with text, but it works just like a GUI. So
I guess it's like a little bit like saying a web browser is a document-based UI.
yeah, it's
And you
technically
can look
correct,
at,
but not.
hey, we're having this whole video live stream recording across the internet, across the world in a web browser, and there's only a little text on the screen, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the term TUI is stuck, but it's a GUI that runs in your terminal.
Well, I think originally it was pretty text-based. Like
It
the
was,
advanced version
yeah.
might be a progress bar, right? Or emojis or color.
Yeah, exactly. So those are technically text, but it looks like images. So you've got emoji. You can have lots of like I'm looking at my Starship prompt, and it's got like a little snake because it's in Python, that kind of stuff. That is technically text, but it is graphical. And progress bars, you create a bar using characters, but essentially you're creating an image. So I think the distinction between like text user interface and graphical user interface is fuzzy now. If you say TUI, I'll know what you're talking about, but
Yeah.
I just don't like the term. I don't think it's as clear. I'm not sure we even need the distinction.
Yeah, I hear you. Are you familiar with BTOP? Have you seen this app?
Yeah, that's really, really pretty. I like the fading effect.
I mean,
The,
this app has just crazy amounts of graphics, and it's all written in the terminal with live updating. I don't know how many graphs, but many, many graphs. Cruising along.
interesting thing about BTOP, I think most people who run it don't run it because they really need to keep an eye on the performance of their cores and file system, etc. I think a lot of them run it because it's retro cool.
It is retro cool.
It looks cool. It looks like how you thought computers were going to look.
Yeah,
When
I'm
you
gonna
first,
be a programmer and a hacker. I'm gonna be a
Yeah.
super tech guy. And this, yeah, you know what? It could be. This could be a movie UI. You know how when
It
you're
could be,
watching a movie, they're like they for whatever reason won't
Yeah.
run Mac OS or Windows. They come up with some weird variation that's got
yeah,
weird graphics.
and have
like
some
this.
dialogue like, I've got to hack the Gibson. Okay, done.
Exactly.
And they put up something.
Oh my
computer.
god, this is Visual Basic. I know Visual Basic. I'm
know
gonna get his
this,
IP
yeah.
address. It's like what?
Yeah.
No. Oh boy. Anyway, I think just this is a really, really cool example of pushing way, way, way beyond. This is a graphical user interface. This is not a textual user interface, right?
Exactly. I mean, technically it is text, but it's
Yes, I
also
know.
graphical. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have two things that you guys make. We've got textual and rich, and maybe it's worth talking about rich for a moment since that's the foundation.
Sure. Okay, so Rich basically formats data in a very pleasing to the eye way. You can print, say, a Python dict, and it'll format with an indentation, and it'll colorize strings and things. And you can print things like tables quite effortlessly, syntax highlighted code, and you can use up to 16.7 million colors. Essentially, it
Wow.
was a toolkit to prettify terminal output with as little effort as possible. And it's all kind of integrated. So you can put syntax highlighted text inside a table or a progress
Hmm.
bar inside a cell. And everything kind of works together. So it's a single coherent system, because some of this stuff existed prior to Rich, but they were written by different authors, and they weren't designed to work together. But
Right. Maybe
Rich
there's a
makes it,
table, a
yeah,
table one by one person, and then a progress bar by another, and they didn't really work the same or integrate or things like that. Yeah.
exactly. So it meant that terminal output was still quite basic. When color was used, it would colorize a single line or something like that. And it helped, but it wasn't great for visually parsing that information.
Mhm.
But Rich gave you that ability that when you write output, it is readable. I think prior to that, we developers kind of built up this skill of staring at monochrome text with funny characters and numbers
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
somehow pulling out meaningful information out of that. And it took years to develop. But hopefully now we don't need to, because you can write things to the terminal that looks much like the output you'd get in a browser. It's formatted and readable and colorful.
Yeah. One thing that might be worth talking about is the live updates, like live
Uh,
tables and stuff.
yeah, so in Rich, you can create a live object. That's what the class is called. And basically, it clears the screen and it writes the output. And then you can refresh it. And it can do that quickly, like 20 times a second or less, depending on how much data you've got. So you can create animations, you can create dashboards, you can create like a scrolling list of text. It, but it was limited, because
Yeah.
all it could do is update information regularly. It wasn't interactive. You couldn't click or scroll or even detect key presses. It was purely for updating information. It's kind of like a very rudimentary predecessor of Textual.
Another thing that's interesting is what's the frame rate of a terminal? People think of it just kind of scrolling text and printing out text, and you see it kind of going by, and you're like, well, that's kind of how the UIs must be. But you can actually push these things pretty far, right?
You can. The interesting thing is, I don't think anyone who sat down to develop a terminal was thinking in terms of frames per second. They were just they want to optimize the text output so that if you cat a large file, it didn't take forever to scroll through.
Right, or didn't flicker around or something. Yeah.
Yeah, and later on, people like myself and others were creating animations and things, and they're thinking, well, how fast can I push this? And it turns out pretty fast, because the terminals use like your GPU to render the text, and if you send it text fast enough, it'll keep up mostly. And I found that 60 frames a second is completely workable on most terminals. You don't really need that for most apps, because if you're scrolling text, you can only move a character at a time. It's not pixel perfect because it's kind of like a grid. So if you want to scroll at 60 frames a second, you'd have to move 60 lines in a second, with which text would just kind of whiz by.
Yeah, it just gets blurry anyway.
Yeah. So it can do 60 frames a second, which is sometimes fun for animation effects, but generally you don't need it. You can update it 10 frames a second, and it'll look nice and smooth. But it's nice to know that you can. We've got a ridiculous demo, which creates a really colorful gradient and then rotates it at 60 frames a second.
Wow.
And it looks very cool. It would be a terrible in an actual app because it just burn your retina, but it is possible.
Yeah. Reminds me of the early days when computers just started having VGA and stuff, and people would come out with amazing graphical. What do they call them? I can't remember what they call them. Anyway, I think I was thinking demos as well. Yeah, I think that is what they call them. And we would download them off of BBSs and watch them. We're just like, wow, it's so good on my 486 DX. I can't believe it could do it. It's so smooth.
Yeah,
They were amazing, right?
Similar deal with the terminals. That the manufacturer of those devices back then probably didn't have graphical animations or games in mind when they were building those computers, but then you got some interested parties who were willing to experiment, and they actually managed to make it do things which the manufacturer just never intended. It's the same thing with the terminal. No one ever sat down and created a system to display 16.7 million colors at 60 frames a second. It was other people that just tried that and got it to work. So there's an amazing amount of creativity and freedom in working and stuff like that, which I kind of missed from the old days, because now computers are so fast and so powerful.
I know. People don't have to even worry about it, do they?
Yeah.
They don't. So I think I want to kind of work through this. You have this live demo, the official Textual demo, which you can install. Let me go. I think I'm at the next. No. So if I click on it, it tells me how to get it. Which props for the install step here. The UVX. Are you a UV convert? Are you a UV fan these days?
I am a fan. Yeah, I mean that I think is a killer app that you can send someone a fairly short command line and they can run your project. The Python, it says -- Python 3.12. That was because at the time it wouldn't install a version of Python that could run on. I think Astral's working on that, so I think in the future, maybe now, you could just do UVX textual-demo, and then it would just run. But even so, I think that's a beautiful way of allowing people to test your code with very little barriers. I really like it.
Yeah, especially the script stuff now. You can just have a single script and put the dependencies at the top and just say, was it UV run? I can't remember exact syntax, but basically you can embed what it needs to run just as a comment, and it'll run. That's excellent.
Yeah, it's no harder than it needs to be, which is great. It's very clear what it does. It works very well. It's the kind of computing that you want. You don't want to have to send someone a page of instructions and say, go and download this software and then write this into your configuration file. That's just a headache. I don't want to deal with that ever again. I just want to send people a UVX blah and they're done.
I agree. If you have UVX, you're good to go, right? And you don't even have to have Python, and you also don't have to worry about the version of Python. So these are all good things. So let's run it, and let's see what happens here. There's a lot going on in this demo. Chris May out in the audience gives you props for making it so easy to run. And Hugo says, I can drop the Python. As you imagined, I can just say UVX textual demo, and I'll probably get 13.1. Let's see. Something's happening.
I think it worked if you had that version of Python, but if you didn't have the correct version of Python, it would sometimes fail. But
got it.
Maybe they fixed it. Yeah.
Maybe. So when this thing pulls up, it looks very much like a web browser, with the main difference, I think, that there's not a lot of pictures, as in true graphics, right? But if you imagine like a really nicely styled website that maybe use color and emoji and CSS, but just light on graphics, right? I feel like, what would you say, like that's kind of extent.
It is. It's kind of like a minimal web interface that focuses on typography. That
Yeah,
sounds a
but I
bit
do want to
pretentious because
point
you've only
out.
got one font.
Yeah, 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 exactly. You can't. Yeah, but as we'll see, you can actually do graphics pretty well. So,
Yeah, if you see the numbers up at the top,
mhm.
there's nothing in the
And
terminal
for
that
people,
displays.
most people listening, so they won't know. But at the top it says
All right.
like version, then it says 100, GitHub stars 27.2 thousand, how many forks and so on. But those are colored differently. They look different. Okay, now tell us about the numbers.
Yeah, sure. So they're taller and wider than the rest of the text, but there is no alternative font in the terminal. Those numbers are made up of other characters, box drawing characters. So you've got like a vertical line, a horizontal line. You've got a curved corner. You've got like a T section, and you can assemble that and make it display something that looks like
Oh,
numbers, and it
interesting.
does look like
And it looks
like
great. You even
numbers.
got the little
Yeah.
subscript for the thousands, the K, the kilo
Yeah,
stars, kilo stars.
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah. It's a, if I remember correctly, it's a 2 by 3, no, sorry, 3 by 3 grid of characters, and I had to hand edit this in Python by cut and pasting the box characters from Wikipedia to assemble numbers. And I discovered the numbers work quite well. The numbers look like numbers, and I've also
Great.
got hex digits, so I've got A, B, C, D, E, F. I tried to keep going, but I found that some characters didn't work at all. Like an X, there's no diagonal cross piece in these Unicode characters, so an X just became impossible with a 3 by 3 grid. But for numbers, it works beautifully.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. A little bit like a classical alarm clock where the numbers, it's
Like a
light up.
7-digit display, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, very similar, yeah.
Exactly. Cool. All right. So if you run the demo, it comes up with comments that show you, or sort of a walkthrough of what's possible in these little boxes. And it says, look, you can scroll it. You can scroll it with your mouse. Just, it scrolls that section. It says you want to go to the next one. Hit tab, hit enter to open it up. It's, even though kind of like we were talking, even though it's a user interface, like with scroll bars, and I can grab the scroll bar and go to it, and I can click on the things and so on. It's also very keyboard friendly, right? This is probably a super important aspect of building these types of applications in the terminal, because people expect that, right?
Yeah, very much so. So a lot of Textual was inspired by web development, because I was a web developer for many years. And there's a lot of work being done in interfaces in the web world. Lots of work, loads of developers working on it for years. I want to bring some of that to the terminal, but I also didn't want to lose what made the terminal interesting. Terminal is a very keyboard focused thing. So I wanted textual apps to also be very keyboard focused. The mouse is terrific for discovering things. You can move it around and there's tooltips, etc. You can click those links, or you can press the key. But if you use an app regularly, you'll want to learn the keys. So it is very focused. You can use the keyboard for everything. There's in the footer that displays all the main keys. You can also use tab and shift tab to move around the various elements. You can use up down to scroll. So you could get by without ever using without ever using the mouse, and it's there if you need it, but you don't have to.
Yeah, that's incredible. It's got code highlighting. It's got a lot of different things. For people who maybe want to get started with this, I think there's let's say three things that are worth looking at. One, you actually, you said you were a web developer, so you must have been a fan of view source, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So you basically added view source.
That's right.
To this as well, right? You type
Yeah.
you type C, it says so at the bottom, and that pulls up the source of the current page, just like you would at my website or any website, right?
Yeah, I want people to realize that the code behind it is not that complex with Textual. It looks like complex. What you're viewing at the moment is actually Markdown. which you might think that's quite hard to render Markdown in the terminal, and well, it is, but we've done it for you. So you just embed a widget in somewhere in the code. It'll say yield Markdown, and then it'll have the contents, and it renders Markdown. You see there's a code block there with syntax highlight code.
Yeah, well, that's the magic of these libraries, right? It's hard once for you, and then it's easy for other people.
Yeah, we suffer, so you don't have to.
Exactly. I feel like the biggest example of that in the Python space is Jupyter notebooks, right? All that interactivity and all that stuff. People are writing TypeScript and JavaScript and all these kinds of things. It's for Plotly and the other plotting UI things, and that's so Python people can write Python code and not write. They're not creating websites; they're just typing in a notebook and they get interactive things, right? But that's probably the biggest take one for the team, sort of deal.
Yeah, it's a lot of work under the hood. And a lot of people that use Jupyter Notebooks, that's their only knowledge of Python. They think Python is Jupyter and Jupyter is Python. And that's fine. It's a tool, and it gives them access to all this stuff, which would be very hard otherwise. So I think Jupyter's a great example of that.
Out in the audience, we have David points out JP term. Are you familiar with JP term?
Yes. Is that David Brokert?
Yeah. The successor of MB term, and it's Jupyter Lab in the terminal. Amazing.
Yeah, it's gone full circle. It's like the Inception movie.
It really is, right?
Yeah, but you can embed a textual app inside Jupyter, so you can have JTerm working in a textual app inside Jupyter that's also displaying another notebook.
Yeah, incredible. All right, so if we go to the terminal where I got this running, and anyone else out there listening wants to check this out, just run it. And I was starting to say there's 3 places you should check out before I got kind of starstruck with Vue code. Okay, so I think there's probably the best place to get started is to look at the widgets. I don't know what you think, but just like, well, what can this framework do in terms of what are the building blocks? Is that you can look at the widgets, and then once you decide, okay, this is pretty interesting, I think people should check out the projects, because there are some pretty interesting things. I know we've covered them on Python Bytes that are built on top of Textual. And then just to talk about the graphics, what is this game?
This is a game in inverted commas. It's got different names. Sliding tile puzzle. I think it's the most common thing. You've probably seen it before. You got a square. The square is made up of lots of little tiles, and there's one space, and you can move a square into that one space. And the goal is to like reassemble the image. But for here, I've used code. So you got all these tiles with code on it, and you got to reassemble it into actual working code, which I think is what most people think developers do. This is how we make code, just by sliding these tiles around.
Yeah, I remember one of my daughters, I can't remember which one, was like, saw me typing out code, and she's like, "What are you doing? What is that?" I'm like, "Working on this project, this program, this website." That's what websites look like. Okay,
Yeah, my wife calls it the gibberish. She says, "Are you working on the gibberish?" Yeah, I am. Yes.
That's incredible. That's an amazing way to put it. Yeah, I was just thinking the other day, like the incredible power of text, right? You think of all these systems, the internet, Linux configuration, source code, design through all of that is just words, right? It's not working with GUIs and all that stuff. It's just typing
Text
it out.
is very important. I quite like websites that skew graphics and have just kind of like typography based thing. I find you can more easily extract the information you need. But most websites these days you go to, and they've loads of ads, loads of image, they pop in and out. The text seems almost secondary. So I'm a big fan of just text. in general.
Yeah, same. All right, so people can play the game. That's kind of interesting, right? Like I said, I think where maybe it's more interesting is talking about the widgets. And when I look at this, what this reminds me of is it reminds me of if I were to go over here and type Bulma and which Bulma is a very refreshing CSS framework that doesn't require build tools and shaking and Webpack and all that junk. Or like Tailwind. Or Tailwind is kind of a pain to work with, but it's also super beautiful, right? When I look at this, the widgets, it feels very much similar to that, right? I'm sure people have checked out CSS frameworks, and it's like,
that's
yeah. Tell
probably
us about it.
yeah. So I mean, again, coming from the web, I want to have a web-like experience because everybody's familiar with the web. It's like you can sit someone down a website and they'll be able to use it. I wanted the same thing for terminal apps. Like some terminal apps have a bad reputation of being hard to use, and it's mostly deserved. Like, how do you quit Vim? It's a running joke.
I know how to quit, Vim. You reboot your computer. Everybody knows that. Come on.
Exactly, but I wanted like an interface that people were very, very familiar with. So this is actually in alphabetical order, but I think buttons was actually one of the first things I developed. Because the terminal doesn't give you anything for free. The terminal is just text with escape sequences for color and style, like italic, bold, etc. But there's no escape sequence for a button. The simplest atomic user interface thing.
No.
A button with a bit of text that you click. There's nothing in the terminal spec for that. So you have to start from scratch. And we built this button that looks buttony.
It even has like a 3D sort of raised effect and stuff.
Yeah, so there's like a lighter color at the top and a darker color at the bottom, and it looks like a classic Windows raised button. You can imagine if this light is like coming from the top and illuminating the top edge. Some people don't like them. I think one of the reasons is it has to take up 3 characters. In order to get that effect, you have to take up 3 lines.
I see.
So it creates quite a chunky button. Looks like a button, but it's chunky. But you can style it very trivially to be like 1 line long, so your button can just be as tall as it needs to be.
Nice. Yeah, these are great, and we've got other things. I was thinking as you were talking about the primitives you have to work with. I was thinking of pretty much every 3D rendered thing that people see. Video games and others as well, animations. They're just triangles, right? There's just a bunch of triangles, which is so insane that you think that thing that looks like a real forest, every single thing on the screen is some weird triangle with a texture and stuff applied to it. But a lot of them.
Triangles,
Lots. You can't think too hard about how fast things are happening on graphics cards because your mind will melt. It's like there's so much going on. You got check boxes, radio buttons, and radio buttons, which are great. A lot of the things that people might think about, data tables. This is if you're doing data science. I think one of the things worth talking about, because when we talk about some of the performance things, there's a lot of this within that, right? Like in your data table. So this whole UI, I can scroll up and down and see all the different widgets. But then when I get to the data table section, I can scroll horizontally and vertically within the data table itself, right?
Yeah. You can also press Control A, and that'll maximize it.
Oh, yeah. Very cool. I didn't even know about that.
Yeah, this is a nice feature, which I think websites should have, and GUIs in general. I remember Windows used to suffer from this. You'd get like a dialogue where you had to enter a lot of text, but the dialogue was this size, and you weren't allowed to resize it.
You can't resize it.
Yeah.
You tap over and hope you hit the right button that you can't see.
Yeah. So I added a shortcut key which can maximize anything which is focused, make it resize it to the size of the screen.
Nice. Okay. In the interest of time, let's go and talk about projects real quick. I think one of the things that probably can inspire people a lot is some of these these projects here. If you go to the project section, you've got a couple that are super nice here. For example, I would say this posting I know by Darren Burns is pretty interesting. This is
Yeah,
like
that's
Postman, right? Like a HTTP client, but entirely in your terminal. Tell people about this. This is great.
yes, this is something that Darren Burns built, and he's a developer of Textual, one of the developers, and he made a fantastic job of this. This is not a Textualize project, but basically it's Postman, which is a tool for making HTTP requests. You might use it if you're developing an API and you want to experiment, and you don't want to have to build all the tooling to talk to your API. You can just go straight into this interface and experiment and play around with it.
Yeah,
And
I did that 2 days ago.
yeah, and it's super useful, and the fact it's in the terminal is like completely appropriate for this kind of application, because that's where you're going to be a lot of the time. It just seems to be the right place. If you have your app in a browser, it can take you out of your flow if you're developing and having to switch over a window. But having it all on the terminal is super useful. And this project has sort of grown in feature set, and I think it's comparable to some much larger projects, including Postman.
Yeah, nice. And open source, right?
Open source, yeah.
Yeah, cool. What other ones do you want to give a quick shout out to?
Well, yeah, we can go through them there. We've got Memory, that was written by Bloomberg. They were an early adopter of Textual, and it's kind of a memory profiler, so it can run your Python application, and it can pinpoint exactly what's taking up too much memory, or if you've got a leak, you're in a loop and you're reserving objects, you don't know about it. It can alert you to that, which would be very hard to actually debug without any kind of tool. So that's a fantastic project.
Yeah, I had them on not too long ago to talk about it, and yeah, this is a super cool project. I think also just graphically, it's pretty neat, right?
Yeah, it displays all the information that you need right there in the terminal in a nice way. I mean, I can imagine a previous version of something like this writing out a big spew of JSON, which you've then got to study to
it's like
to figure out.
We've saved a CSV file. Now you can look at it. It's like, oh, great.
Yeah, exactly. But if you can look at it in a graphical form in a nice table, you can visually parse information much quicker, so you can pinpoint things.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit around this, but another huge benefit of these types of UIs with Textual is the ability to run them remotely on servers and other, or on a Raspberry Pi, or on things that are embedded types of stuff that you just only access through the terminal, right? Like if you wanted to do memory on your web server, you probably don't want to just open up a bunch of ports and start serving, a parallel HTTP request over it, or something, right? But if you SSH in and you just run this GUI that's updating, it's really nice, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's you don't even need to have a desktop. You don't need to run a server, and like you said, you don't need to set your firewall to allow a particular port and then configure the application. All that's gone because it's a text interface. You just need to have a shell SSH into the server and then run it, and you can see this nice interface there, because it is just purely text, and there's not much text involved. You'd be surprised. The amount of text that needs to be sent over the wire is surprisingly minimal. If you compared it to a YouTube video of the lowest quality, I don't know what the lowest quality is, like 120p or something.
360 by 240 or something. Who knows?
Yeah, that would be vastly more data than like a text interface like this.
Yeah, even if it's madly updating. Yeah.
I mean, you could actually, you could, if you want to push it. Like if I was to run this ridiculous demo with a spinning gradient at 60 frames a second, and setting the screen size to ridiculous, it might turn into a video. But for most interfaces,
but is it It's probably applicable for like gzip transfer as well. Text compresses really well. I don't know.
True.
Potentially.
It depends
I
what
don't
you're
know what
rendering. Like,
I don't know what SSH does. I don't know. Maybe it does.
I
Maybe it
would,
does.
I would think it compresses.
I
Compresses
would think
and
so too.
encrypts. Yeah, I would hope so. But yeah,
Yeah, well, the
it's a
compression should be cheaper than the encryption. So yeah, why not go ahead and
yeah,
compress it while you're
right,
at it, right?
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So somewhere in here, we've pulled up so many things. I pulled up your article that I wanted to talk about
Right.
as well. So let's talk about this. This was your. You said you wanted to write an article for sort of celebrate the 1.0 milestone for Textual. And the
Yeah,
article was called Algorithms for High Performance Terminal Apps. And I thought there was just some fun things to pull out of here. So I thought we could maybe talk through some of them.
yeah, sure. So there's lots of interesting technical problems to solve with Textual, and lots of cool solutions. But I so very rarely have the chance to talk to anyone about it because it's one of these things that's kind of under the hood. It just works. So
Yeah.
there's nothing to discuss. So I wrote this blog post to describe some of the cool things that go on. The most core part of Textual is the compositor. This takes all the widgets. If you've got an interface, it might have data table button checkboxes, and there might be loads of those, and it might be able to scroll through it. And Textual has to take all those widgets and assemble them into a single update, because there's nothing in the terminal that does a kind of a tiling window manager. You just write text to the terminal. So the software has to create this illusion that you've got windows and things that are overlapping. And that's essentially what the compositor does.
That's great. And you've got transparency. That is sort of, oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's kind of magical. It's like it shouldn't be possible in the terminal.
No, it should not be possible.
It cheats. You're not seeing true transparency because the terminal's not capable of it. You can't put like an X on top of an A and then see the X translucently with the A in the background. But you can change background colors. So if you put something on top of a background, you can calculate the transparency on top of the widget underneath it. So you can create the illusion of background of transparency. And that's something that the compositor does as well.
Yeah. Is Textual pure Python?
Pure Python, yeah.
Wow.
I had thought that at some point we would have to write something in Rust. And I bought a couple of Rust books, which I haven't read yet. But every time I got to a point where this is a bit too slow, I found a very good optimization in Python. So it turns out that it's just not necessary. I mean, if we were to write some core code in Rust, I don't think we'd get a marvelous speed up. We might get 5-10% if we're lucky for a lot of effort. But since it runs on a lowly Raspberry Pi, it's not been necessary. Python's been more than fast enough.
Yeah. And you can just ride on the coattails of the faster CPython team.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
That helps
It's like
too.
a new version comes along, we can say Textual just got 10% faster.
Textual has some sort of concurrency framework too, right?
Yeah, so it's based on async IO, and every widget from a button to a text area to a checkbox runs an async IO task. So all these things are running concurrently, potentially updating the state, and Textual will update things accordingly to the schedule of the widgets. You might have a widget which, say, updates 10 times a second, another widget which updates when you press a key, and another widget which updates infrequently. And Textual will combine those updates into a single update so that it looks clean, it doesn't flicker, and it's what does the magic of updating things.
Yeah. Awesome. That's super neat. I think UI frameworks and async IO, async and await, they make a lot of sense, right? It's event driven stuff, and so you can, instead of polling or whatever, you just say, I'm going to wait till this thing has some kind of event, and then I'll work on it. And if that doesn't have an event, I'm going to go work on something else. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny that async IO was obviously, you can tell by the name, it wasn't intended to build user interfaces, whether in the terminal or not. It was built for IO, but it's very good at handling concurrency of any kind, and including text user interfaces. So I'm a big fan of async IO. It's not perfect. There are a bunch of gotchas which come up in our support channels. For instance, someone will be playing around with Textual and they'll say, well, I'm going to need some long-running tasks, so I'll simulate this by putting a sleep in. They'll do like sleep 10. And then
the whole app just locks up. I can't believe
exactly. So it's not perfect, but there is no perfect solution to concurrency. But I think, it's as good as it can be with the current level of technology, I think.
Yeah, very neat. Free threaded Python. Have you played with this? Is it going to influence that kind of thing?
I think so. There's a whole lot of cool things that free threaded Python can do. We've kind of convinced ourselves that we didn't need that kind of level of concurrency, for like a web application or something, because it's very linear. Yeah, and the I/O gives you concurrency in a sense because you're waiting for the I/O. But I think free-threaded Python, I think we need a better abstraction for concurrency, because having to explicitly create a thread and run it requires that you think in terms of threads, which is quite challenging.
I think it should be the same as async IO. It should be async and await. And there should be some kind of marriage between them where you don't really know as you're consuming it,
Yeah, unfortunately, async IO is single-threaded. You can use multiple threads, but you've got to consciously write the code.
Yeah.
I would like to see an async IO where it just distributed work across the cores.
Right. If it's IO based, just keep it on the same thread. But if it's computational based, then you're gonna need just put it on another thread and give me a future sort of thing to await. Yeah, and we don't care. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think in the future we're probably going to get something like that, because I think free-threaded Python is so valuable that people are going to want to use it more, and they're going to build these better abstractions. So I imagine in a year or two, I don't know, maybe less, we'll have an async IO that's free-threaded or something like it.
Yeah. We say that we don't need it for web apps because we can just scale them out, right? We'll just run 4 of them, four worker processes, but there's a big memory cost to running. Well, I've got 16 cores, so I'm going to run 16 worker processes, right? They each take half a gig. Like all of a sudden, you're like, oh, 8 gigs just for this. If there were just so I can get computational parallelism, right? Which is not
exactly. I mean, the IO gets you a lot of the way there, but sometimes you accidentally create CPU bound code, which would run very, very poorly. But if we were using all our threads efficiently, then that should be easier.
It should be easier, yeah. It's super easy. Like, I've got an ORM and I'm going to return 20,000 things that I'm parsing into Pydantic objects for fast API. All of a sudden, the most of the work is the serialization that's computational. Anyway, all right. So let's get back to this. I think that's super interesting. We could do a whole nother hour on that probably. So one of the things in here you talked about is thinking in segments and not characters or stuff for drawing terminal apps. Let's talk about that, because I really want to talk about the switching the primitive idea you got, but I think this is a good setup.
Yeah, sure. So people who aren't familiar with the inner workings of terminals might look at a terminal and think it's like a 2-dimensional array of characters. Because it does seem like that. And if you're building a textual app, you might think so you could compose a screen full of text like a bitmap, as if the characters were pixels. And as developers, that would be like stuff we're very familiar with. We could easily build that and create stuff with it. But the problem is that terminals aren't 2-dimensional arrays of characters, and it's for one reason is that some characters take up twice as much space as others. Chinese, Japanese, and Korean text typically take up 2 characters because their characters are more complex. They deliver more information in a single character, so they have to be wider. There's also emoji, which many emojis can take up twice as much space.
Got to have the snake emoji.
Exactly. I think that might be 2.
I don't know how wide it is.
Some emoji are 1, like a smiley face or something, but some emoji are 2. And if you were to treat it like a 2-dimensional array, it kind of falls apart at that point because, if you subtract 1 from the y coordinate, it's not directly above the original coordinate. Mm-hmm. So in situations like that, rather than trying to fudge things into the primitive that you first thought of, you can come up with a new primitive, a new way that represents the very lowest common denominator thing you want to do. And for Textual, that turned out to be segments. So rather than a character, it's like a pixel, we use a segment. A segment is a string, any number of characters, plus a style. And by assembling these segments, you can represent anything in the UI. And all the operations which are done are kind of built on segments. So I call this switching the primitive because the original primitive was like a character as a pixel,
right.
Which didn't work. If you were to, you could use that to with a bunch of fudges to build on top of it. But you might find that it falls apart. Things which should be straightforward suddenly become really complicated. And that's because as developers, we tend to layer primitives on top of other operations. And if the very foundational primitive doesn't represent your problem very well, then it can fall apart. So the switch from pixels to segments worked very well with Textual. And Textual is essentially a segment processing engine. Everything that Compositor does takes in a bunch of segments, manipulates them, spits out new segments, and then those get turned into escape sequences.
Yeah, very cool. I think this idea of switching the primitive, people who are new to programming or new to Python, especially programming, I have a hard time. I see the code, I look at someone else's code, and I see the code, and it makes sense. But then when I sit down with a blank screen and try to solve a problem, I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. And this switching the primitive concept of like, we looked at it this way, and it just seemed so complicated and intractable. And then I decided to rejigger maybe the data structures and how we organize stuff and how we combine them, and boom, it just unlocks simplicity actually. Kind of like going back to our triangles and graphics. It's like, well, if you think in pixels, 3D game engines are impossible with ray tracing and lighting and shadows. If you think in triangles, all of a sudden it unlocks it, right? And sounds a little bit similar. And I think that's a pretty valuable lesson for people to take.
That's exactly right. So if you had a game engine and the only function it had was like put pixel, it would be a nightmare to build anything but the most trivial games. But the primitive of a triangle means you can build 3D anything. So that is the better primitive.
Yeah, and they have angles, so they have reflection, and so they have all sorts of stuff.
Yeah. Something similar came up when Darren was building the text area. So the text area has lots of operations like insert a new line, delete a character, delete a line, delete a paragraph, cut and paste, etc. And the primitive for that boiled down to a very, very simple primitive, and that was replace a range of text with new text. It's like anything you can do to a text area comes down to that primitive of a range plus new text. Like to delete something, you replace a range with an empty string. To insert something, you replace a range with like the insertion character, like a new line plus the previous string. So everything boils down to like one very simple primitive. And once you've found the right primitive, bigger problems become much, much easier.
Yeah, 100%. It's amazing the way it works. So we'll get short on time. We got pick one more lesson from here that I want to talk about maybe.
The spatial map was quite interesting.
Yeah, I think so too.
bit further down. Yeah. So one of the problems we had in Textual, when interfaces get complex, we've got lots and lots of widgets. Some of them are visible and some of them are not. Some of them are scrolled off. They're still there in memory. We know exactly where they are. And when we come to render that, the most obvious way to do that is to step through them in a for loop for widgets in all widgets, do stuff to a widget. But that means we're iterating over all the widgets every single time, even if they aren't visible. So the spatial map was an attempt to optimize that. Basically, it's a very quick way of deciding which of the widgets are on screen and which of the widgets are currently scrolled off. So we literally don't need to even loop through the scrolled off widgets. And the way we did that briefly is we kind of logically separated the terminal into a grid. There's a step where you go through and assign every widget to the grid squares that it might overlap with. Small widgets might be right inside a grid square. Some may overlap one or two or more. And then once we've got that information, it's very easy to pick out which widgets are visible and exclude which widgets aren't, because we can take the screen, figure out which of the grid squares it covers, and then we can go through those grid squares, and there's probably just a handful of them, and each of those grid squares is associated with a list of widgets which are under that. You can combine that with a set, and then very quickly you've reduced that problem domain from being potentially unbounded very large to like very small. Some of the widgets might actually not be visible. They might actually be in a grid square which is off the edge of the screen. But we can just loop through those and discard those ones. But that's a much smaller operation than looping through every widget. In the
interesting.
application.
You talked about it's fast enough in Python. And it's this kind of stuff that makes it fast enough in Python, right? If you rewrote this in some other native compiled language, it would be faster to go through every single one of them, but you're still potentially processing a tremendous number of things, and you get the compositor and overlap and all those kinds of, and you're like really worried about stuff that's way off the screen.
Yeah.
Instead of going, we're going to rewrite it, you can just think like, well, let me think about the right data structures and the right algorithms and so on. Yeah.
I mean, I would love it if Python just got so ridiculously fast. You don't have to worry about that, and I'll take any speed improvements to give. But the optimizations you can produce yourself just by having the right algorithm, they tend to outweigh the benefits you could get from, say, running it in C. If I was to re-implement that in C, it would obviously be faster, but it would still be much faster to have that algorithm.
Yeah, exactly.
Plus
like,
the
I'll take my order of O squared versus your your O factor or your n factorial versus n squared. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Eventually,
exactly. So
it's gonna lose on n factorial no matter what you do, right?
Yeah. I mean, Python wins because of the speed of development. We know it's not the runtime speed.
Yeah, absolutely.
The runtime speed is okay most of the time, but it's the speed of development. The fact that you have got more time to pick the right algorithm, means it's not as slow as people might think.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't get too complicated. Yeah, thinking about this, I think there's a lot of parallels back to game engines, and I think about a lot. Like the game engines have this thing called oct trees, like basically break stuff into 8 squares, and you say, well, which I'm looking for a thing if it's going to say intersect with this, right? For business, like for hit detection and stuff, like, well, is it in this half of this world or that half? Well, it's in this half. Okay, well, we're not even going to compare it against half of the things in the world that are in that half. Now break that into hash, right? Like you can super quickly go, I have 1 million objects on the screen, but I can determine if this thing hits it with 5 comparisons or something like that. You know what I mean? With just the right data.
That's exactly it.
It's super interesting. Yeah.
And it's probably like no coincidence that I used to work in video games.
Did you? Okay,
So that was kind of my mindset. It's like reducing the problem. See, and Textual is quite a lot like a video game. If you imagine like a 2D video game that's got lots of sprites that are over here, we don't want to worry about those. Replace sprites with widgets, and it's pretty much the same problem.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's the same kind of mindset.
It certainly is. All right, well, I think we're going to need to just kind of wrap it up here because I think we're getting short on time. Let's leave everyone with roadmap. Where you've hit this 1.0 milestone with Textual. where are things going?
So there's a whole bunch of features which I want to implement. I mean, Textual is usable as now you can build fantastic apps, but there are a few things where we don't have parity with web apps. Something I've implemented on a feature branch is arbitrary text selection. So you know, on a website, you can just draw your mouse over text you want to select. That didn't work well with TUIs. If the terminal did it, if the terminal doesn't understand the logical separation of widgets, it would just copy all the text on that line, which might get parts of one widget and parts of another. So I've implemented arbitrary text selection, which seems to work quite well. And it's such a fundamental feature, I think.
Wow.
It'll make Textual more useful.
Yeah, I guess if you got a UI in Textual and you're like, I need to get that and paste it into another document or search it, highlight the map, the address to put in a map or something, right?
Yeah, and things like, if you're using Textual to talk to an LLM and the LLM writes some code, you don't want to transcribe that code visually.
Yeah.
And so now we could be able to we can select the entire code. You could add a button, but it's very convenient to drag. So that's something that's coming very soon.
Awesome.
And yeah, there's a whole bunch of features I've got, which I'll be working on. Yeah, watch this space.
Excellent. And PRs accepted, contributions accepted?
Very much so. Yep. There's a big pile of them there, but I tend to work on a big feature and then spend a few days going through the PRs.
Yeah.
And I love to have PRs. It means that people are very interested, and it saves me time, of course. If someone else is fixing bugs and writing code, then it's a great thing.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for coming on, giving us an update on Textual and all the stuff that you guys built. It's super valuable to people.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you bet. See you later.
Bye-bye.